Historical fiction has that extraordinary access to truth, and because it's true, it is always more powerful.
Hello and welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. I'm your host, Oliver Webb-Carter, and today I'm talking to the best-selling author Conn Iggulden. Conn's books may well be familiar to some of you. Along with his brother, he wrote The Dangerous Book for Boys and his Emperor series of novels, which were written in the early 2000s, a classic historical fiction based around the life of Julius Caesar. Pleasingly for me, he's recently turned his attention to ancient Greece, and he's written about the battles of Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea. His latest book, Lion, which is out now, is the story of Pericles and Cimon as they take the fight to the Persians, even after the great victories during the Greco-Persian Wars. Pericles is perhaps Athens' greatest politician, and Cimon its greatest general. And Conn kindly gave me his time to chat about horses getting sick, illegal sleeping on sacred Greek islands, and ancient toilet stones. Elsewhere at Aspects of History, we have some great pieces to read on our website for free. Among them, Jesse Childs, who's written about the English Civil War, Adam Zamoyski on Henry Kissinger's recent intervention on Ukraine, and Ronan McGreevy on the assassination that sparked the Irish Civil War. Now back to Conn Iggulden. I do hope you enjoy our chat, and if you do, please subscribe, and if you can, I'd be hugely grateful if you gave me a good review. Conn Iggulden, welcome to the podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you on today.
It's lovely to be here.
Well, we're here to talk about your new novel, The Lion, and this is, I think it's the start of a new series that the publisher was telling me, but it does follow on from your previous novel of last year, Protector, doesn't it?
It does to a degree. They've called it Lion, by the way. We got rid of the definite article. There's just not enough time in this modern age to even waste a second on a single word. Although, I mean, obviously, it's based on the dream his mother is said to have had before he was born, of a lion, and then it became the insignia on his father's shield, which he would have carried at Marathon and so on. So it's a pretty good word for the young Pericles, the lion of Athens. Yes, it does follow on. The original couple of books were dealing with Gates of Athens and Protector were dealing with the Persian invasion, and Pericles was just a boy with very little sort of agency. I mean, his biggest event really was being evacuated and sent to the island of Salamis, just outside Athens. And then from that vantage point, he saw Athens burned, set on fire twice by the Persian forces. So, because he had to be evacuated again, without walls around the city, they really didn't have a decent. Well, there was no way to protect themselves from the Persian invasion at that point. So, the first two books are more about people like Aristides, the wonderful stories of how they resisted Thermopylae and Plataea and Salamis and all these extraordinary battles. But it's also about the beginnings of Athenian democracy and how they really got going. And then it made sense to when doing the actual story of Pericles, which is two books, one called Lion, one called Empire, to sort of set that slightly aside. I've always written books about interesting people, Julius Caesar, Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan, people like that. And, it made sense to give it a slightly different series title, even though it does follow on in sort of time terms, almost day by day.
Well, I finished it today, and it's a riveting story. It's great stuff, and but it's wonderful that you've picked this period because you're a hugely successful author, but the Greco-Persian Wars, and then obviously the 5th century is the golden era for Athens, and there's so many rich stories. But you'd have to say Pericles probably does dominate that century more than any other Athenian politician.
Yes, and that particular century, the thing that I avoided all from so many years was any hint of Alexander the Great. because when I was probably no more than about 18, 16, I read a couple of books by David Gemmell, which were fantasy slash historical fiction. It's a difficult sort of genre because there was a heavy element of fantasy, but it was also a life of Alexander the Great, effectively. And it was done so well that I thought, apart from anything else, that I'd be interested in writing historical fiction. It was one of the things that turned me onto the genre. But also, I need to never go anywhere near Alexander because I cannot match this. I cannot, reach this height. So, having avoided Alexander for my entire career, I avoided all of Greece as well, thinking that, sort of one would lead automatically onto the other. But they didn't, of course, they didn't. As you say, there are centuries of good stories that have nothing to do with Alexander the Great, although there is an Alexander of Macedon that turns up in the Persian invasion as an ally of the Persians. And that was sort of fun because I knew the reader, if you see Alexander of Macedon in the same sentence, I knew the reader was going to jump to the wrong conclusion, which is fun playing around with that sort of expectation. But yes, the stories of people like Pericles, Themistocles, the extraordinary battles, things like the sea battles of Salamis, but also the great characters. It has nothing to do with Alexander the Great, and Greece is a rich enough society to support a few authors trying to make their way.
Absolutely. And, I definitely detected your little playfulness with Alexander in the previous novel. I've got to say, Alexander the First, and for our listeners, Alexander the Great was Alexander the Third. So they should check out Alexander the First because he's a hilarious character, I always find.
Yeah, he was an interesting man. And of course, he was, if I remember rightly, he was pardoned by Cimon. I mean, the point, and that got Cimon into some difficulties at a later stage with a whole trial as to whether you should ever let an enemy combatant leave the field. So he turns out to be sort of pivotal. But yes, his main role in this was just to throw the reader the wrong way.
Yes. So you've mentioned him there, Cimon.
I tend to go on my son's pronunciations because he's the one who's got A levels in Latin and Greek, and he's pretty good at this kind of thing. So funnily enough, my copy editor, a man called Tim Waller, who is the same copy editor I've had right from the Gates of Rome back in 2001. He studied classics, I think, at Cambridge. I don't want to give him the wrong university, but I think it was Cambridge. So he's always been hugely useful on a personal basis because he can say things, you're wrong about this, Con, that almost no one else can say. And I do like to be accurate. Apart from anything else, I have learned that when I'm not, people write me the most stinging emails, particularly with Rome. It turns out that there are Roman reenactment societies all across the country who take a very dim view of whether I suggest a peculiar tunic colour or shield shape. They will write to me in the most unpleasant terms. So I've learned to try and be as accurate as humanly possible, and then just to hope for the best and hope I haven't missed something. That is my great fear, I should say, of historical fiction. I used to call it the Amalfi lemon problem, because if you wrote about the Amalfi Coast and missed out lemons, you would be missing something so fundamental that everyone would know effectively that you hadn't done your research. And I always worried that there would be something like in Athens of 5th century BC, everybody had a weasel in their house to control mice and rats and things like that, which happens to be true. That sort of little detail I need to get right, because otherwise, I look like a complete fool. And I always fear that I've missed something absolutely dreadful, and something vital to the society. It's hard to get that kind of little detail right, but I do my best,
Yeah, well, I know it's definitely work. I think you've definitely succeeded. I studied ancient history at uni, and absolutely loved it. And so I was looking over at some of my old material books as I was reading your novel. Not to, I should hasten to add, not to find any errors at all, just because it's such an enjoyable subject. So I was reading Thucydides and the Persians by Aeschylus as well. But the source material, I mean, the advantage I would have thought, being a fiction author in a period where it is the dates are a bit blurred, and it is difficult to pin down, it does surely make life a little bit easier for you.
It can do. I used to refer to historical fiction authors as the gods of the gaps, because you have to sort of find the gaps, and then that's where you would put your fictional story. I mean, something like Bernard Cornwell and Sharp is a reasonable example. And there are gaps in the stories of Pericles. I mean, for example, the name of his sister wasn't recorded, or the name of his first wife. So if you're writing a man's life, obviously I'm going to have to make up those people and their characters, from a blank sheet. Or a sort of more technical detail. I mean, the Battle of Marathon, the Athenians who marched out to confront a Persian force in the Fennel Field, which is what Marathon means, on the coast, they discovered that the Persians had no cavalry. Now, the Persians definitely had cavalry, so we don't know where those tens of thousands of horses went to. Possibly they were never disembarked from the ships. Possibly they'd been put back on the ships. Possibly they'd all been sick, because horses get sick at this. But no one knows. The Persians didn't record it. The Greeks didn't record it because they didn't care. All they found was an infantry force, and they beat them, and they went home again. So they were delighted. But what the heck happened to the Persian horses at Marathon, we will never know. I have to write that into the story because it's not something you can usually ignore, especially not if you're going to have a major cavalry force turn up later at Thermopylae and Plataea and places like that. You need to explain what happened to the horses. But there's always gaps like that in historical fiction, and for the most part, I sort of revel in it. Wilbur Smith wrote a series of books on the Courtenay family. This was one of my,
I love those. I used to read those.
One of my heroes, and also one of the people effectively who taught me how to write by reading their stuff. And I loved the original stories because as he went through the generations, I would know more about the grandparents of a character than they knew themselves, because I'd been, with that character. And that was just wonderful. That allowed me to do a sort of depth or richness of plot when it came to people like Kubla Khan that, really helped. But I noticed those stories went right up almost to the modern day and involved suddenly a young lawyer called Nelson Mandela. And he was alive at the time. And I remember thinking, God, he could sue. If you wrote a scene now with him kicking a dog or something like this, or doing something terrible, I mean, he's still alive. Suddenly I was confronted with the difficulty of coming too far into the modern day when people might take a very personal view of what you've written about them. So I'm happy to some extent back in the safer millennia of ancient Rome and ancient Greece. It's a sort of more comfortable spot.
And did you find Plutarch's lives a rich source? Because I should also recommend those to our readers, after they've read your novel, of course.
Yes. Yes and no. Plutarch, of course. I mean, this is one of the things about historians and historical writing. A historian of any kind will dispense with a battle in 2 sentences. And if it's a key event, I can't do that. I have to do a point of view, perhaps an opposing point of view, the sweat and the smells and the colours. And I tend to think in very strong sort of sensual terms of how to make this vivid for the reader. And historian doesn't have to. He can dispose of all of that in a single paragraph or whatever. And also with someone like Plutarch, in his Life of Brutus, for example, I remember one thing that irritated me was that he said, some people say that Brutus was of noble stock, but others, or noble bloodline, but others, especially those who were supporters of Julius Caesar, said that he was of a common line. And that's fine for Plutarch. He can have it both ways in the same paragraph, but I clearly couldn't do that. If I was writing a life of Julius Caesar and it involved a life of Brutus, then I had to either make him of noble stock or of common stock. And if I did that, I was going to annoy the Roman reenactment people who would say this is complete rubbish. And I still occasionally get emails from people saying that how can you say, oh, I don't know, that this happened when Brutus was Julius Caesar's son. Now, he clearly, to my mind, he clearly wasn't Julius Caesar's son, partly because he was at one point engaged to Julius Caesar's daughter. And even in libertine old Rome, they didn't engage their sons to their daughters, even their sort of half sons. So I think that's probably, I'm pretty comfortable with the way I've worked it. But Plutarch and other historians have a freedom, if that's the right thing. I have to fit the history into a story and a story arc, and that means that there have to be cliffhangers, and there have to be exciting moments of crisis and tension, and it also has to sort of come to a satisfying ending. And history just doesn't. By definition, it simply, at the end of 1066 and all that, history came to and there's full stop. But it never does. It always continues on. Actually, it was one of the difficulties of Pericles that, oh, I don't want to give it. Well, it's such a tricky thing, giving away the end.
Yeah.
Everyone knows the Titanic sinks. It is ludicrous to go into it. There isn't a person who saw the Titanic who didn't know that the ship went down. So I don't want to hurt people's feelings or upset them when I say that Pericles has died 2,500 years ago. I think it's reasonable to sort of expect that he's no longer with us. But the manner of his death and the fact that the Peloponnesian Wars didn't stop, then actually they went on for decades afterwards, was very tricky, because from a story point of view, you want it to come as the climax. You want the story, the old show must go on. You want the show to stop at that point, and you want a period, frankly, where nothing happens for a few decades. But that just isn't the case, and that's the messiness of real life, and that's why I like historical fiction, because it is a wonderful challenge, but it also has that truthfulness and messiness of real life. Pure fiction for me would be difficult. It would lack a certain. It's not that it isn't incredibly powerful. We've all read powerful fiction, and after all, it is always about people, and people are interesting. We are the species who are interested in ourselves. The proper study of man is man, and so on. But historical fiction has that extraordinary access to truth, and because it's true, it is always more powerful. The first thing people always say is, good God, did that really happen? And, if the answer is yes, then you've created a more powerful scene than it otherwise would have been.
So with the story that you've written here, we're just at the end of the Persian Wars. We've got it's almost a new Athens has emerged as along with Sparta, the victors over Persia.
Yeah.
But you've written this brilliant scene of when, really the founding of the Delian League. So I wondered if it would be good to talk a little bit about that, because for our listeners, that helps frame the century for Athens and Sparta.
It does. And I must admit, it's not something I knew about when I was starting. So I always have to guess at the level of general knowledge. For your readers, it's probably higher than most, obviously, because they're by definition interested in history. So for them, it might be really obvious and old hat that the Delian League was founded on the island of Delos, which was said to be the birthplace of Artemis and, oh crikey, who was the twin
Apollo,
brother?
I think.
It's Apollo. Well done. By the way, I always wanted to. It's forbidden. It's absolutely forbidden to spend the night on Delos. And who was that? There was an author who did it. Gerald Russell, have I got his name right?
Was it Gerald Durrell?
Gerald Durrell, the one who said a taste as old as time, a taste as old as cold water. Ooh. And he managed it. He evaded the
really?
On the island and spent the night there. And I've always envied him. It comes down to one or two things I'd like to do before I die. And one of them, I shouldn't say this obviously in public because I'd never be allowed to land on the island, but would be to spend the night on Delos, because that would be an extraordinary thing to do. But
yeah, I always thought the Greeks were a bit touchy about sleeping on beaches as well.
They very much are. Yes, I mean, especially in sacred spaces, and this is why I shouldn't be mentioning this in a public interview. I'm just tempted to say I might as well say it now. My other long-term thing that I will probably never manage. No, I better not. No, it's the fact that Colditz has been recreated as a hotel, and I would very, very much like to go there and escape from Colditz. And I won't go over the roofs or something without paying my bill. I'm not sure that appeals to me in a sort of fundamental way, and I'm probably too old, and I'm overweight, and my knee's gone, so it's extremely unlikely. But I do like the idea. But to get back to Delos, Pericles' father, of course, Xanthippus, the wonderfully named Xanthippus.
You're a huge fan of Xanthippus, I can tell.
I am, apart from the wonderful quality of his name, which means a pale horse, which I couldn't help but think of the biblical thing, even though nobody then would have thought of that at all. But the fact that he was called a white horse or a pale horse is just wonderful as a synonym for death. And the fact that he was at Marathon and then went on to played a major part in keeping Athens free from the first Persian invasion. And then went on to be this extraordinary statesman, almost responsible for the concept of a nation, moving from city-states like Athens and Sparta and Thebes into the idea that you can all be Greek Hellenes. An awful lot of that was down to Pericles' father, and the idea of they swore a great oath on Delos, which was physically marked by ingots of iron, taken presumably from the cargo holds of their warships, where you would use iron to make the thing stable, like a keel, and then dropped into the sea. And as long as they would last, the oath would last, which was intended to be for eternity. It didn't last for eternity, but it was an idea that bound together cities and regions and states, really not just around the land either, but also, various islands on the Aegean, into a sort of proto-empire, an Athenian empire. And at the time, it was an extraordinary, almost a NATO to some extent of the ancient world, because it was a pact of mutual defense. Not an aggressive pact. It wasn't meant to be a challenge to Persia. But if attack one, you attack all. And of course, Athens was the big financial powerhouse of that, because it had the fleet. It had the extraordinary fleet that had come together to fight the Persians. And it's as a result of the Persian invasion, really, that this came about, that they got the fleet together. And through the fleet, they saw that trade equals power, equals authority, and equals potentially a nation. And that's the foundation stone of Greece to some extent. And it was a wonderful thing to be able to write. And it's a good story.
It certainly is. Now, the other character who I also can tell you're an admirer of is Pausanias, the Spartan regent and victor of Plataea.
Yes.
It is rather an unfortunate story for him. So I don't know if we can sort of I don't think we should give anything away, but
this is the tricky bit, of course, again, giving things away. But it's first of all, I like one of the things about writing historical fiction is you have the advantage over real life of the fact that you can describe what they're doing and also what other people say about them. But then you also have their inner monologue, their inner thoughts, which I don't know about you, but I don't have when I'm in normal life. So I can kind of add a layer of understanding to them. And to understand a character is to know them, is to love them. That's almost not too strong a word. So it's so far impossible for me to write about a character in depth especially over a period of books like Julius Caesar. I had Julius Caesar in my head for about 7 years. And that meant by the end of it, and Brutus as well, that meant that I could sit down and write a scene. If you gave me a sort of topic, I could write a scene involving them that would at least be consistent within my books. I won't say it would be sort of magnificent, but nonetheless, it would be a real, consistent character, because he had effectively become completely real and more real than real to me. And so,
can I just ask, what was that like? If you've got Julius Caesar in your head, if you were sort of going for something to eat, were you sort of thinking, well, what would Julius Caesar order right now?
Well, there's an element of truth to that, because that's back to the little details. When it's one of I immerse myself in information when it comes to, and then most of it seeps away again. They say education is what's left when you've forgotten everything you were taught. That's true of historical fiction research as well, because there was a time when I was pretty good on a Roman kitchen and whether they had windows or not and what the spoons looked like and things like this. So yes, if I went to a restaurant, in theory, when with it all fresh in my mind, then I could be comparing and contrasting the fish sauce presented to me to the fish sauce they used and so on. So it becomes, yes, it's quite immersive, but it's more it's like if you knew everyone's private diaries as well, then you would know a little bit more about them than simply how they looked, how they stood, how they reacted to you, how other people reacted to them. All of these things are vital, of course, in real life in judging the people around us, but it's that inner monologue that makes them real. And for me, that's, it's hard to let go. It's hard to not love a character. So when you get to someone like Pausanias, given the wonderful, almost epic nature of the fact that he knew someone who was told he would have 5 victories and misunderstood this to think this meant he had to compete in the Olympics as a pentathlete. And then it was pointed out to him that the Spartans considered battle victories. They called those, was it contests or victories? But they used the same word. So that actually although he wasn't successful, he didn't win the pentathlon, but he would perhaps be somebody who had been promised 5 battle victories by Apollo, and at the Oracle, and therefore he was an incredibly valuable man to have around. Having that part of his story and the way that worked is just sort of epic, and it's wonderful. And that was Pausanias's friend, and their relationship together, the way Spartans were expected to act around Athenians, the way the Athenians were resisting Spartan control, even though everyone expected the Spartans to lead in battle suddenly after Delos in particular, after Salamis, after winning at Plataea, the Athenians were feeling a little bullish, a little bit like they didn't need to be pushed around and led always by the Spartans. And that's a crucial part of the story, the development between those two cities. And of course, it's what led to war between them. The Spartans always assumed they would lead and did lead. They led at Plataea, for example, and the Athenians accepted their leadership without question. But over time, as Athens became more and more powerful and richer, then they had the sort of authority to start saying no. And the moment they said no, they were war was effectively inevitable. I mean, this is the backdrop to the life of a young man putting on plays with Aeschylus in Athens, and you can't ask for more. God.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. I mean, there's so many rich characters in there. Aeschylus, is among them, and
yes,
it's fantastic.
Again, the fact that Aeschylus was at Marathon, the fact that he saw his brother was killed at Marathon, and we know he lost a hand so he presumably bled to death. I mean, he was a man who'd seen war, who'd seen violence right up close and personal, but he also wrote some of the most extraordinary incandescent plays that exist, and we have in his The Persians, we have the first play that survives in the Western canon, because unfortunately the plays before then have been destroyed and lost, and that's another example of the gaps. There are only fragments before then, as far as I know, no full plays, and his satire plays, which involved such vulgarisms as people walking around with bobbing phalluses and in things like that. There is only one complete example of that, so it's very hard to judge an entire genre from that sort of thing. But the details of the Athenian play and the way the benches were made of Persian warships, for example, and
it's fascinating.
I love all of this. I mean, it's this sort of thing. It's very hard when you come across something like a really cool fact, and you want to put it into the book because, for example, the fact that Spartans didn't box, because when they exercised, they ran endlessly and they wrestled constantly and they lifted rocks and as weights and so on and so on. But the reason they didn't box is because that means that half of every bout would involve a loser, and they didn't feel that they should ever train men to lose. But the Athenians did box. Now, that was a fact I put in. So then I was able to write a scene where, in a personal fight between an Athenian and a Spartan, then I have the Athenian using boxing techniques which the Spartan wouldn't have known. And I was delighted, absolutely delighted by that, because it's a good way to work in just a really cool, interesting thing that I'd found out. I mean, that's one of the reasons I love doing it, of course, because you do come away with interesting facts. I mean, you do in all books. I learned from Dick Francis, off the top of my head, that horses can't vomit. So if you make a horse sick, as in on a plane or a ship, it just gets sicker and sicker and sicker, and it cannot expel anything from its stomach, so it eventually can die. And this has stuck with me from Dick Francis, the Queen's champion jockey. So I accept his authority to tell me this is true. It better be true, by the way, because I think I've used it in a couple of books. You learn, you pick up things from fiction all the time, and historical fiction is a good vehicle for that, because if you're interested in the subject as well as the story, you pick up interesting things.
Yeah, you'd have got a letter by now, I'm sure, if you're correct.
I hope so.
Yeah. So Kimon or Kaimon, I'm now doubting which one how I should be saying it. But he's this amazing general. He really is. But his father was brilliant as well.
Yes, Miltiades. I mean, he was the one in command at Marathon. I was probably very unfair to him, but I needed a storyline about someone being less than keen to go into the battle for that, because I had to explain a court case that happened afterwards when Miltiades was accused of failure. You have this appalling Athenian system, this wonderful safety valve of being able to take anyone, no matter how powerful, no matter how authoritative, how successful, I mean, someone who played a key role in marathon, so literally saved Athens, was then, he had a fairly minor in comparison, campaign that went wrong, and the Athenians banished him. I mean, they fined him something like 60 talents, if I remember rightly, and and then he was going to be arrested, and then he didn't get banished in the end because he died of his wounds. So that's right. They fined him a fortune, which was the sort of fundamental amount they used to start the Athenian navy. So Cimone's family, and then as he became the commander of the navy, yes, it wasn't a story I knew at the beginning, but through his father and then through Cimone's own successes, things like bringing the bones of Theseus back to Athens, the famous king, the one the hand that attacked the Minotaur, and so on and so on. Bringing those bones back and leading in key battles. And I don't want to give away too much of his story, but he played a fundamental role in saving Athens, especially as the Persians did not give up. And after Thermopylae and Plataea, they were ready to go again on 2 or 3 other occasions. And it was really only Cimone that stopped them doing that. And therefore, his story it wouldn't sit still. It wouldn't, it wouldn't stop asking to be told. And I think that's a vital part of it. I mean, his relationship with Pericles is absolutely key to it as well. Even though Pericles also stood against him at one point in a law trial. And the big question for me was whether he was, anyone could prosecute any law trial. So the question was he doing it deliberately to help his friend get off, or whether he was actually trying to, prosecute his friend? And that's a tricky one. That's a matter of judgment. I won't tell you which way I went because, the readers should find this kind of thing out. But the business in Athens of only needing 6,000 votes to banish someone for 10 years. So half my major characters, including Pericles' own father, get banished for 10 years. Cimone gets banished, Themistocles gets banished, Xanthippus gets banished, Aristides gets banished. You have the wonderful story of Aristides heading towards the Agora, and he comes across an illiterate man, and the man says, would you mind scratching the name on the pot, on the shard, the ostrakon, from which we get the word ostracize. And he said, would you mind scratching the name? And Aristides says, yes, because he's a literate man. He says, whose name would you like me to scratch for the banishment? And it's the name of Aristides. I mean, this is a wonderful story, and he does it. That's the point. He puts his name on the pot and then hands the pot shard back to the man to go and vote for Aristides the Just, as he was known, to be banished. But it was a safety valve because there was no appeal against it, and there was no counter vote. You only needed 6,000 votes out of an assembly of about 20,000 to make that person just disappear from public life for 10 years, and probably, of course, lowered life expectancies and the like, probably forever. Although 1 or 2 people did come back. And then the wonderful thing about the first couple of books, Gates of Athens and Protector, is that if the Persians invade and you have banished your major generals, which the Athenians had, you have to ask them to come back. you have to bring them all home. And that was an amazing sort of series of chapters to write, because I had literally ships going out to find them, these people that they banished, and bring them home again, because suddenly they didn't have the luxury of banishing their major generals and war leaders. So it's a fascinating society, actually.
It really is.
Yeah.
Can you imagine if we, the electorate, had that power today to ostracize?
Well, we'd use it, wouldn't we? I mean, the danger of not having a counter vote was seen even in ancient Athens, because it shocked people. 1 or 2 of them were banished, and probably Cimone was banished. He was sent away for 10 years, and he really shouldn't have been, because they desperately needed him. He's another one they brought back. But yes, I think it would be hard in this day and age with petitions and so on. There's an element of Athenian democracy perhaps there that probably isn't an accident. The idea of giving as much power as possible to the people to vote, in some sense, it started in Athens, and it's been valuable ever since to the people, because the only alternative is either tyranny or the authority of religion. You get a theocracy of some sort, and it's a tricky thing to accept any authority, really. I mean, why should I do what you say? It's a tricky one. I don't, but even if there's if a million of you say that I should do it one way, then as much as I might dislike it, then I will accept it, because I can't find another authority that I'm comfortable accepting. And the Athenians seem to understand that. And frankly, it's a lot more noble in some ways. It's like Churchill's thing. It's the worst of all systems except for all the others. I mean, that's about the best you can say about it. But I do prefer it to being told that I have to do this because the man's a nobleman, or because he's a favourite of the king, or a mistress of the king, or whatever it is. I'm not sure where else authority can derive that would, that I'd be comfortable with. This is the only thing. Democracy, the demos, the mob, the crowd is the only real font of authority, as far as I can tell. Like it or not.
Yeah.
Love them or loathe them. It's absolutely
the tyranny of the majority, I suppose. Yeah.
Well, it is exactly, and it can be a tyranny. But on the other hand, what's the alternative? And that's the only thing, because the alternative is always someone saying, "Well, I know best," and you think, "Well, do you?"
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one thing I did want to mention is you've I think hinted at that already, is that we don't know who Pericles' first wife was,
Yes. Married to. She was married to, isn't it ridiculous? They often didn't record women's names with anywhere near as much effort as the men. So she was married to a man, I think, called Hipponicus, if I remember rightly. And there's 2 or 3 possible men that they might have meant. So it's not 100% clear. But no, she's a non-character. All we know is that effectively she was older than Pericles. She had been married before. And that they got and had 2 children, of course. His first 2 sons, Pericles and Xanthippus, named for his father, came from that marriage. So they're sort of vital players. And then the fact that they get divorced, and that's pretty much it. Everything else has to come from the pen of fiction, if you like, simply because the details aren't there. So you do the best you can, and you try and make it. For me, it was tricky to do a whole relationship from sort of meeting in slightly unusual circumstances, and then right through to falling out with one another and becoming absolutely sick to the sight of one another. It is a tricky thing to write and do well, without, by the way, making my hero character, Pericles, look like a complete monster, because it's tricky to write a marriage breaking down. Though people say bad, unpleasant things, and it's hard to maintain your heroism when you are in a shouting match with your first wife, But
it's also, I think, difficult because the way women were sort of viewed in that period were essentially to produce children, and that was about it, really. Which for modern audiences is difficult.
It's a tricky thing. I mean, obviously, yes, because especially in the sort of, let's say, wealthier classes, women were expected to stay indoors most of the time, tended to by slaves. And poorer women did tend to go out into the agora and the street markets and so on, partly because they had to. It's like the business of bedrooms, that poor people tended to sleep together on a single bed, whereas wealthier people had separate rooms and separate beds. There were different classes, and the way they treated women and the way they interacted with women were different in those times. But yes, in general, the female characters, although I suspect they played as important a role as women always have in every aspect of history, were not front and foremost when it comes to the writing of the history. Herodotus and Thucydides and so on tended not to record the influence of the women. But as I grew up with a sort of working mother, and I have a wife and daughters, then I have some idea of how history is always driven along by the women. And frankly, I would not have done half the things I'd done if my wife hadn't pushed me or persuaded me or convinced me that I was good enough to do it. The role is important, and I know that. So when I'm writing ancient history, the historians might have left them out, but I tend not to.
Does she read your final or throughout, or what's her role in your process?
I will use the word heroic, because it's not so much that she reads them, but it is the final thing I do with every manuscript before I hand it in, is that I read it aloud from start to finish. Which
really?
It takes you days, because it is very, very time consuming, but it is the only way for me to do a slightly different perspective that means I can catch errors, and I do it as fast as I can, so that I'm still remembering chapter 3 when he went west, and then in chapter 18 when he's no longer in the west and he's suddenly in the east, and I realise I've made a mistake. I notice plot errors, but it means my wife has to sit and I would say endure. I mean, I know that this is putting my own stuff, under a spotlight. Perhaps it doesn't deserve, but it is. Not everyone enjoys an audiobook, and I will be honest. I have a monotonous reading voice. I hope not a monotonous speaking voice,
Oh,
but
no.
when I'm reading, I tend to sink, according to my wife, into into a monotone.
Well, I
And
was going to ask if you sort of act characters when you're reading out the.
I do a little bit. I do. If I'm writing I mean, I do, because there's all sorts of things. I won't call them tricks, but there's also sorts of techniques that I might do. There might be a short sentence that I know is followed by another short sentence because I'm trying to play with the reader's appreciation of time. And I sort of want almost a flashing image followed by a flashing image. So I might read that in a particular way because I know the technique that I'm trying to. Somebody else might not necessarily spot what I'm doing there. Or there might be echo. Somebody emailed me this morning to say, actually, the book that's just gone out, he said, was it deliberate that I said about a ship landing on the shore, and I said dead where it had been alive, and then about a chapter or so later, and it comes back onto the water, I said alive where it had been dead. And was this deliberate, or was it just a coincidental echo? And I said, no, that was deliberate. I do this kind of thing deliberately. I work on words in the way they sound and the way they work against each other all the time, which does affect the way I read it aloud sometimes. But it's worth it for me, and she seems to, I'll say she seems to enjoy it, but we're still married, so.
That's good. That's good. Now, the opponents of the Greeks are the Persians, and the way you've written about them is there's the great scene with a Persian doctor, cleaning, talking about how clean you should be, and it just made me think. It's like those realities, what everyday life was like in the ancient world. I mean, they didn't have Lynx deodorant, did they? So, but little details like that I find really interesting, and I love the way you introduce that into the story.
Yes, I mean, all these sort of things, they do fascinate me. The whole idea about how often you should bathe and whether you can use oil and scraping it away. I mean, I've covered some of these things before in ancient Rome. Some of the Greek things, I'll tell you the thing that bothered me the most, and it still bothers me because I still don't fully understand how it worked, was the fact that they had no toilet paper of any kind. And they used something that is only ever described as toilet stones. Now, I don't know if that made you wince, but when I thought about this, and if you Google Greek toilet stones, you will see, frankly, some stuff that looks pretty abrasive. I was expecting maybe marble or something like this, but they look more sort of pumice stones or whatever, the point, or tile, and they don't look like the kind of thing I want to go anywhere near. That part of me. And even then, the idea of trying to use that to clean oneself makes me wonder how on earth it worked. No wonder you had to bathe regularly. I mean, dear God. So that sort of detail I find oddly fascinating because it's important to get right. Like shaving, everyone over a certain age had a beard. That's true, but some were clean shaven, so they did have razors. And if you've ever tried to strop a cutthroat razor, you know how difficult it actually is to do to keep a really good edge without shaving becoming quite so almost agony. So it's things like that. Did they have good enough quality steel? One thing leads on to another, and you can never lecture about it. You can never drop this kind of thing in because it's instantly history. So it has to be revealed through the scene. Pericles getting up in the morning and he is shaved by a young woman standing behind him. And it's things like that for me make it as real as possible, because you are trying to drop the reader into a society. And whether it's the way a Persian talks, or the interesting sort of different tactics that they used, or the way the king might speak to his mother, I try and get this stuff right, if at all possible, because it's important. I don't want the reader jarred out of it. And I always, I avoid using words like silhouette, for example, because I think it was Etienne de Silhouette who invented the sort of blackface shadow cutting of card. And he was a Frenchman of, I think, your readers will say I'm wrong now, but it was.
I didn't know this, so this is fascinating.
I think, I avoid using a word like boycott, for the same sort of reason. If at all possible, I avoid using anachronisms in the text, just because I know that they will jar. People will be jolted out of the story, and I really don't want that. I want them to be completely lost in it and turning every page, ideally, with breathless excitement. I mean, that is always my aim, and I don't want anything to interfere with that.
Well, I did. I think that you wrote it with humour as well, which I definitely appreciated. My wife, her parents are Iranian, so anytime a Persian appears in a story, I love, particularly with a bit of humour in. I always sort of mention it to her. But she was telling me that Gulshan, Gol in Farsi, is this a name of a character who's a Persian? I'm just for our listeners so they're aware. He's called Gulshan, which she was telling me that Farsi Gol is the word for flower, which makes sense because his name is garden, isn't it?
Yes, he refers to it as a garden. Yes, and then there's a moment of silence. That was me being funny or trying to be funny. Yes.
No, it was funny. It was funny.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's an awful lot of humour in life. I mean, in a normal sort of any normal interaction, there will be banter, for want of a better word. So it's vital to put that kind of thing in. And I mean, my father was in the various parts of the RAF, including Bomber Command during World War II. And so he lost people sitting next to him once or twice. And the examples of completely black humour that he had, I mean, incredibly grim stuff that he would sort of turn into or would find amusing, or it influenced me without a doubt. It made me aware that actually it's a response to trauma. Particularly men, we tend to make some stupid joke when someone's just had his head cut off. It's ridiculous, and it's not in any way to trivialize or to mock it or anything like that at all. It's just it's another safety valve, and therefore, if you don't include that, well, you're back to it not being quite realistic. You need someone to say something ridiculous at exactly the worst possible moment, because in real life people do, and you're trying to write real life. It has to come across as plausible. Which I mean, I do the best I can. I'm not saying I always get it right, but it is the constant struggle of historical fiction to make it as real as possible, bearing in mind that you are dealing with the values of people, of societies which are not always your values. So if Genghis Khan,
the past is a foreign country, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it is. And if someone like Genghis Khan turns his children out into the snow and basically saying whichever one of you survives can come in, then that's not it's not an easy scene to sort of appreciate. But these things happen, so you have to be. I do try not to bring a modern critical tone to it, which is a little bit helpful. The fact that my dad was of a previous generation, born in 1923. His father was born in 1850. So he had my dad at 73 and lived to 95. So my dad knew a very elderly Victorian growing up. So as ridiculous as it sounds when I'm writing about the ancient world, I do feel sometimes that I've had an experience or access to older values than most people of my generation. Put it that way. Yeah, and that's always been valuable. The sort of, again, the rough humour is an absolute crucial part of that. Also, from my mother's side, I sometimes mention the fact that she was brought up with somebody, an old lady who had been damaged by the Spanish flu of after 1918. And I say damaged, she wasn't physically, her lungs were okay, but she'd had a sort of mental breakdown, and which is an interesting aspect of it that most people don't hear about. And so she could be found out in the garden when planes went overhead. She was found in the garden trying to bring them down with a pair of tweezers that she was reaching up into the sky and trying to pull them out. And if they passed a motor car, when they were in their pony and trap going into the local town, they had to cover her head with a blanket because she became so upset and frightened of the noisy, smelly, dusty thing roaring past. Which is, again, I'm pleased to have known the people who knew the people. This is an access to aspects of history that is not common experience, I don't think.
I love the way you got our name in there as well. Thank you. The next novel, when is that coming out then?
It will be. I've just finished it, which is, literally 3 weeks ago. So I'm getting emails in and responses from the publishers saying that, thankfully, that they liked it. It's the final part of Pericles' story. It's the building of the long walls and the dealing with the Peloponnesian War, the Sparta and Athens going to war. So it's the sort of, the culmination of 4 books, and that will come out it won't be until May next year. I mean, the publishers do have it early, so I don't know. They could do it earlier than that, but they tend to lay out, as you know, sort of 12 months, 18 months ahead. In fact, it's something I worked out right at the very beginning of my career, that they really wanted to know that I wasn't going to produce just one book, that I had an idea for many, many books ahead, that they were investing, therefore, in a career writer rather than a one-off. And also that the other thing they wanted to know was whether I could take direction, whether if they edited something and I went up the wall and said, it's disgusting, how dare you malign my art, then that might have been a much shorter career, because luckily I had good editors, so this just wasn't an issue. But I found out later that it was something they were interested in. Could I be edited without going completely bananas? Actually, should I tell you a quick story about that? Just
please.
Well, it's just I happened to meet the editor who edited George MacDonald Fraser.
Oh, wow.
And he said George MacDonald Fraser had been a script writer and a copy editor, and he was sort of known for being very, very good with the details. And this particular editor, his responsibility, he knew, was to read the book and then to give comments to George MacDonald Fraser, and he did that. And he had been told to be very careful, because George MacDonald Fraser had made it clear that if there was any real interference, he would consider walking. He would go and find a different publisher. He was not to be mucked about with. And he was already the very old man of publishing. And this is late in the career stuff. And this particular editor read it through, and he said to me, I found on page 87, there was a place where I thought an additional comma would have improved the meaning of the line. And then I had my meeting with George MacDonald Fraser, and he said, did you like the book? And I said, yes, I've read the book. I love the book. And he said, was there anything, you'd like to say? And he said, well, I thought on page 87 that there is a spot where the additional comma might just improve the meaning of the line. And MacDonald Fraser said, oh, well, show me the page. And then he looked at the page in the meeting, and he read it through start to finish. And then he said, no, I don't think so. And he said that was his entire editorial contribution for working with him for about 8 years. Oh, dear. But, that's not me. I do occasionally have characters who dismount from a horse, and then 30 lines later they dismount from the horse again. So, I need to be told that he cannot possibly dismount twice in the same scene. Little details like this that you try and get right, it's extraordinarily easy to do. Despite me reading it aloud, despite me going over and over and over the books, it's amazing. Errors creep in.
Yeah. Well, I certainly couldn't spot any. Now, you've mentioned Alexander, and we're nearly running out of time, but we are running out of time. But Alexander, you've mentioned at the beginning of this, you don't really want to go there. Yeah. But it's sort of, it feels like as a reader, I'm quite keen for you to go there.
I do know what you mean, but I can only say that I would honestly recommend to anyone interested in the period, you've got to not mind a bit of fantasy creeping in, but that's life. And it's a book called Lion of Macedon by David Gemmell, and he wrote another one called Dark Prince. And it is, I want to call it sort of heroic fantasy. I think that's the official name for the genre, heroic historical fantasy, something like that. It's just with Parmenion, the death of nations. And his story is so fantastically well done that I just can't ever. I would have to make different choices. There was a General Parmenion, I understand, and he was Alexander's great general, but I'd have to take the same material and then make different choices. And I've come across this once or twice before. I was looking at, I think it was King Arthur a while ago. I was looking at the possibility of writing King Arthur. And the trouble was, and I studied it in university, I have a son called Arthur. I mean, I've seen every, possible version, the alliterative, the stanzaic, the lot. It was my big thing. So I'm pretty well suited to write a King Arthur story. But the problem was, every time I came across the material, I was thinking, well, I know that someone else has done it this way. So either I take the same material and do what I consider to be a suboptimal choice, or I'm basically writing the same story as someone else, and it wouldn't work. It just doesn't. So the same is true for Alexander. I would either be doing David Gemmell's choices, which would feel fundamentally dishonest and not recognizing the talents of a writer I admire, or I would be making suboptimal choices, which is a rotten way to go about it. I never phone things in. I love to write and I love to tell stories, and I always want to do the best I possibly can. So I can't do it badly. I won't, do it badly.
Fair enough. Well, Conn, this has been an absolute pleasure. I've really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you very much.
And I wish you every success with Lion.
Thank you.
Not the Lion. And actually, I think we're speaking on the 26th, which I think is publication day, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. This is the day it comes out.
Fantastic. Well, it's very good of you to give me your time then on such an auspicious occasion. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, there you have it. Now I've put all the links that we discussed in the show notes, including Conn's new book, Lion, which I highly recommend. It's lots of fun. And ancient Greece is an untapped area for historical fiction, but as I mentioned with Conn, it's such a rich one. Coming up, we've got Anthony Beaver on Russia's Civil War and Gretchen Freeman on the Anglo-Irish Treaty. You can get me on the Twitter. I'm at OllieWCQ, but I'll leave you alone now. Thank you and good night.